Okay.
All right. Well, friends, welcome to this, to Lecture 3 on the theme of Indigenizing Canada. Vancouver School of Theology is the host of this lecture series and is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. My name is Richard Topping. I'm the president of the Vancouver School of Theology, and I welcome you to the lecture. I'm grateful to my colleague, Mr. Hubert Barton, who's the program coordinator of the Indigenous Studies Program, for co-hosting with me. Now I want to introduce another colleague and friend, our speaker for this series. The Reverend Dr. Ray Aldridge is a husband, a father, and a grandfather. He was ordained with the Christian and Missionary Alliance in Canada, and he's a deacon in the Anglican Church of Canada. He's status Cree from Swan River Band, Treaty 8. He was born in northern Alberta, and he now resides with his wife in Richmond. Ray is the director of the Indigenous Studies Program at the Vancouver School of Theology, and boy, are we grateful for that. The mission of the program is to partner with the Indigenous Church around theological education. Ray, in the past, served as assistant professor of theology at Ambrose Seminary in Calgary. He's a former chairperson and board member for Indigenous Pathways. He's also a former director for the First Nations Alliance Churches of Canada, where he's now a committee member and where he works to encourage Indigenous churches. Ray's passion is to help as many as possible hear the gospel in their heart language. Ray and his wife Elaine have been involved in ministry to train people to facilitate support groups for those who've suffered abuse. Elaine and Ray have coordinated Marriage Encounter. Ray and Elaine have 4 adult children. Jenny, who graduated from the University of Regina and Alliance University College, she's a school teacher. Raymond, their son, is pursuing a PhD in philosophy at McGill. Catherine's earned an MA in religious studies at McGill University, and Reuben works in the oil field in northern Alberta. Ray, I want to say your talks have been inspiring, wise, and deeply moving. We have heard the gospel in our heart language from you, and we look forward to your third lecture this afternoon, Indigenizing Canada, Reconciliation as Healing. Welcome, Ray.
Thanks for the opportunity. And hello to everybody out there. And yeah, I'm always scared when I speak. So I'm scared again. I said once into another group, I'm always worried I'm going to suck when I speak. So I hope that I don't. So I'm gonna so in this I'm trying to bring together the idea. Well, I was trying to bring together the idea of story and how it works, and it was key to in the role of reconciliation. And so I hope that comes across, because the place of story was a significant part of my ministry. When I was in my first pastorate was in Regina, Saskatchewan, and it was how Indigenous elders spoke to me. They spoke to me in story. And so I mean, I would go to speak to them and they would talk to me in stories. And part of it was to understand what was going on. I needed to listen to the story. And it was never just the principles. I mean, some elders shared principles with me, but it was always the story. And the story always took place in specific places and specific times. And it was always on the land. And those stories were not ones that I had, and those stories weren't the ones that I had heard in school or that were in the media. And it was not how dominant society had told stories. I think it says that the victors always write the stories. I changed that and I said the dominant always write the story of history, particularly in our modern society. There's a continually rewriting of history to make it fit what people wanted to say. And I remember watching Noam Chomsky's Noam Chomsky in the media, manufacturing consent. I remember watching that and I remember thinking, that's what we do in society. Institutions always sort of rewrite things or spin things in a way that makes it support the status quo. And so then I noticed that there was this split between the way that society was speaking and the way that Indigenous people were speaking to me. And in particular, I was struck that in modern society, it didn't want to admit weakness unless admitting weakness would somehow grant a person tactical advantage in the realm of public opinion. So sometimes people would sort of talk like they were a victim. Like, what's an example today? Sometimes some dominant groups talk like they're a victim, and because they think that will help them gain a tactical advantage in public opinion. And being a man, I remember one of my professors said, he said, men, he was, I don't know if he was talking just about men, but we like to create these power daydreams. And in our daydreams, we imagine situations where we're powerful and we know exactly what to say and what to do, and we'll dominate our enemies and win the day. That was sort of, we all dreamed about that. In North America, this was the case. In Canada, it was the case that Canada did the same thing. They told the story in a way that always, it didn't tell the whole truth. And I mentioned it in one of the other talks that Canada had this myth about how it was a nation of settlers who found an empty land and through hard work and Christian faith made a country that was all about peace and prosperity. And they took the wild land and made it into a civilization from sea to sea. That was a myth that existed in Canada. The problem with the settler myth is that it does not take into account everything that happened in Canada. And it applied the myth of, and it also applied the myth of the empty land or the empty wild land to Indigenous people. And in a book about early missionaries, Austin and Scott note that in Canada, early missionaries in Canada saw themselves as cultivating the land in a spiritual way that would lead to cultivation of the actual land. So then John West, first Anglican missionary in Western Canada, would say things like, the missionary was to cultivate the heath is to convert the heathen, and vice versa. The wild land and the wild people came to be the focus of successive Canadian governments and churches to try to, they interpreted us as wild, as the land was wild, and they needed to improve us so that we could be part of Canadian society. And that continued this idea that Indigenous people needed to be fixed. We were a problem to be solved, continued till at least 1969 in Canada. That was the sort of official policy. Indigenous people were always a problem to be solved. In the writing of Canadian mythical history, Canada is seen as the savior of Indigenous people. And John E. Macdonald thought that what Indigenous people needed was to be improved morally, and then they would be fixed. And residential schools and relocation of Indigenous people were used by the Canadian government to solve Indigenous people's problems. And also the benevolent part, you know, people always, the benevolent part, or what was thought to be benevolent, is that Canada was helping the poor Indigenous people to become better human beings. And so then the idea of removing people from their land or sending kids to residential school, but they didn't often mention that this also removed or freed up land for non-Indigenous people to exploit if the people were moved. Now we need to understand that throughout this period, Indigenous people were contesting that narrative. Indigenous people were fighting against the idea that we did not have law, that we did not have mutual beneficial relationship with the land, that we did not have wheeled carts. So I mention these because Hobbes, and part of the modern myth about civilization, I think I've mentioned before, is Hobbes and then Locke, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes. They write that one of the evidences of civilization is that the presence of law and courts, and the presence of that civilization makes improvements to the land, and the presence of wheeled carts. So then if we would have had Chevy cars, we would have been okay. But and Canada, people continued to, Indigenous people fought against this idea that we did not have a law. Hubert's people, the Niska, as I mentioned before, show up in that the provincial legislature in BC wanting a treaty because they want to preserve the relationship with their land. So they're pushing back against this idea that the land is empty, and they want a treaty that will guarantee their access to their territory. This was like over 100 years ago they were doing that. And they were also fighting against the idea that the Indigenous people had this, they understood they had a mutual beneficial relationship with the land that required them to be respectful more than domineering or shifting, changing the land. And then they also pushed back against the idea that you needed wheeled carts because everybody knows a sled works better in the snow than wheeled vehicles anyways. But they pushed back. However, there was a shift that began to occur in Canada, I think around 1970. Other people who are better at Canadian history will say, no, it was actually 1950 but in 1970, Indigenous people began to tell their story from their perspective, and they didn't paint a pretty picture of what actually occurred in Canada. J.R. Miller, writing on Canada and residential school, notes that history began to be told from an Indigenous perspective. That was a shift that occurred. History in Canada began to be told from an Indigenous perspective, and it was not a positive perspective that took place. As more and more residential school survivors and the survivors of relocation began to tell their stories, the narrative in Canada began to shift. Media began to shift how it was reporting these things. And you can go on YouTube and you can see commercials that I'm assuming the Canadian government used to run on probably CBC television. talking about the benefits of residential school and how positive they were for Indigenous children to get educated at these schools. That shifted. CBC radio, at least in the early 70s, ran at least one show about the 60s scoop, about the relocation of Indigenous people, about some of the negative aspects of residential schools. So there was this shift to begin to talk about what actually was going on. There is still an institutional push, however, to erase any negative and keep only the positive. And I don't know, I suppose on one level that's okay at times, I guess, but I'm not sure. Is it really okay that we destroy thousands of records of the incidences of abuse in the residential school? I think it's coming soon, if not last year or this year, that 15 years would have passed and many residential school records will be destroyed as ordered by the Supreme Court of Canada. I don't know if that's a good thing. The movement by denominations and other NGOs to quickly distance themselves from any hint of wrongdoing. I sometimes wonder if we learned anything from Truth and Reconciliation. The whole process of Truth and Reconciliation was aimed at trying to find another way to work through difficulties of the past. We seem to have difficulty embracing our own failures and want to embrace triumphalism that has come to characterize North American institutions. I want to suggest that in the journey of reconciliation, Indigenous people's understanding of life lived like a story and the importance of story would help us to embrace failure, but also remember it in a different way. And we could yet be known as a country that seeks healing, that even though we are wounded, life is still flowing out of us. That's what I hope will happen by the end of the lecture, or through this, we could kind of see that. So the shift that begins to occur in the 70s, and maybe it grows a little bit as it goes, the shift that begins to occur in Indigenous people's stories, as Indigenous people's stories began to be told, it's sad but true. So the focus that Canada has on Indigenous people, at least since in the recent past, maybe going back to the 1970s, maybe going back to the 90s, it's I don't know what to think of it, but it seems to be that the shift in focus by Canada on Indigenous people, I mean Canada as a whole or society as a whole, the shift occurs usually as a result of or a response to violence directed at Indigenous people. I'm making a conscious decision to say that it is a result of a response to violence directed at Indigenous people, because the events that I'm going to talk about, often public opinion paints those as, portrays the incidents that brought national attention to Indigenous people were violence on the part of Indigenous people. For example, the Oka crisis in 1990. This causes many Canadian people to blame the Mohawk for blocking the highway, and this producing a standoff, eventually a standoff with the Canadian military in July of 1990. The Mohawk, however, were responding to continual attempts by the city of Oka and the government of Quebec to encroach upon Mohawk territory. The city of Oka had decided to try to expand, they wanted to expand their golf course from 9 holes to 18 holes. And in doing that, they were going to cut down some trees, and there was going to be, the golf course was going to run right by the Mohawk Cemetery. And Indigenous people didn't think that was a good idea. The dispute over that territory and the planting of those trees comes about, that had been going on for 200 years. And the Mohawk and the barricades that happened were really a series of events in that long history, but I really say that it was the Mohawks responding to violence against them. And so then after that, but for this lecture, so the Mohawk, the Oka crisis happens in 1990. 1991, Canada orders the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, which is an attempt at reconciliation. It is hoped the RCAP of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People was hoped that the problem in the relationship between Indigenous people and newcomers would be solved. And I think on one level, it was an attempt. I think at one level, it was an attempt, or at least in part, it was beginning to own failure, but not as something, as not as part of identity, but as something in the past. Because it's harder to own failure and to actually do the deeds of repentance. Jesus said that to the religious leaders. I was thinking about that today. I was thinking when Jesus says, you know, your ancestors killed the prophets and you build monuments to the prophets, showing you agreed with them. And then he says to them, bring forth deeds in keeping with repentance. So I thought about that. But Canada struggles with that. Canada struggles with that. So then failure is something in the past, but that's not us. That's not us. That's the way we think about things. That's not us. And so people continue to, I wonder if people listen to the prophetic voice that Indigenous people give to a nation. That's how I think you could understand some of these things that happen. RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, has limited success. It begins to describe or talk about what really happened. It's a good resource that way. It writes down, puts down some of the stories and some of the things that happen. However, like most government documents, it becomes lost on the shelf. It makes several hundred recommendations. And but those recommendations, because they're recommendations, often don't produce a lot of change. It does, however, begin to raise awareness among Indigenous people and those who want to ally themselves with Indigenous people that there's a need to talk about what's really happening. I just talked about Royal Commission on Aboriginal People was a precursor to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That's how J.R. Miller sees it. And I agree with him that it's a precursor, it's an attempt, but there's still hesitancy to admit that Canada is actually guilty of anything. The Liberal government in 1998 makes a statement of reconciliation. And in it, though, it sounds like they're saying, we really feel bad that bad stuff happened, and we sure hope that we can get past that somehow. But it falls short of saying we did it and it was wrong. It was wrong. It was wrong. So in 1995, Ipperwash occurs. So 1991, there's a shift to Indigenous issues in Canada because of the Oka crisis. 1991, Royal Commission on Aboriginal People is struck. And maybe it does what the government wants. I mean, if I was really cynical, I say it does what the government wants. Everybody thinks, oh, good, that's taken care of. We can just carry on now. But in 1995, Ipperwash happens again. And for many in the Ontario government, including Mike Harris, the Anishinaabe, who had occupied Ipperwash and saying like, we were supposed to get this land back and it hasn't come back and we want it back. Mike Harris and the Ontario government order the Ontario police, the OPP, to go in and remove the protesters from this Ipperwash Park. And in that process, Dudley George, unarmed Indigenous man, is shot and killed by Ontario police. And Indigenous people, and again, the focus is on Indigenous. Again, I don't like that, but it's this act of violence or a response to violence. The real violence happened when Canada refused to, they acquiesced on their promise to give that land back to the reserves, that they had relinquished it so that Ipperwash, that area could be used during the war for war efforts. And they relinquished, they didn't keep their promise. So then Indigenous people respond, though. Indigenous people respond. This time, Elijah Harper calls for a sacred assembly in Gatineau, Quebec. And he calls for a sacred assembly in all Quebec or Gatineau, seeking a spiritual solution to the racial enmity that existed in Canada. Again, what I want to emphasize is talking about what happened in Canada from an Indigenous perspective. And I was there at that gathering, 1995. And we talked about how we get to reconciliation, how we come up with a spiritual solution to the problems that existed, this racial enmity between Canada and Indigenous people. But they're talking about it. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission flows out of Indigenous people talking about and needing to talk about what really happened. This was, again, there's a shift that happens because Canada takes another step. In 2008, they finally, Stephen Harper seems to apologize for the assimilationist policies of the residential schools. And the Truth and Reconciliation is struck as part of the settlement to the survivors of the residential school. And Indigenous people want to talk about, or needing to talk about, what happened. And this was not just for the sake of residential school survivors and their families, but I believe that Indigenous people understood that it was also for Canada and all of us to move towards reconciliation. On this level, the residential school, the TRC, I should say, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission movement, was that it was part of a process that was occurring in various places. The most famous one in South Africa, as the country tried to overcome years of systemic racism by telling the story in an attempt to write further how the country healed through these effects, to talk about what has happened. In Canada, it was hoped by Indigenous people that talking would result in healing. I think it was the hope that if we shared from our heart what was really going on, that we would find a way to heal and come together. That's kind of what I think what's going on. And Canada begins to tell the truth, or responds to the truth, by listening, or trying to listen to Indigenous people who, in a prophetic voice, I was thinking, I was waxing eloquent today, and I thought it's like a prophetic voice in Isaiah 58, when God says to the prophet, shout it from the rooftops and tell my people their sin. Tell my people their sin. Indigenous people were calling for the church in Canada to actually do the things that it was called to do, to be a healing movement. This in the face of all the crap and abuse Indigenous people have faced. At this point in history, or at least in the sacred assembly, because I don't know how long it'll stay the same. And sometime I suppose maybe Indigenous people will say, that's enough, I'm done, I'm not doing this anymore. Maybe they'll say, you're an abusive spouse and I'm done with you, that's it. But at this point, I still hear the call for reconciliation. This is because for Indigenous people, they understand that there's something deeper in human beings. I heard the elder say once, there's something in human beings that's deeper than sin. That's deeper than sin. Sometimes the doctrine of total depravity forgets that there's part of us that is deeper than sin, a part that God calls to. The Creator put that there. That means that none are beyond the animating work of Jesus Christ. So that even though sin abounds, it does not mean that relationship are utterly broken. It means they're twisted and damaged, but there remains a bond that connects us, and we cannot merely give up on the quest to find the peace and harmony that we see all around us in our good world. The creation shows us that the law of the Creator requires us to seek reconciliation, and reconciliation could serve as healing in our ongoing relationship, particularly if you think about reconciliation as those three movements in restorative justice, because restorative justice is an attempt at reconciliation, and it's about telling the truth. It's about really listening to one another. And it's about coming up with a shared plan about how we heal the damage. It's not primarily about punishing anybody. It's about healing. So we needed to, the shift that is occurring or needed to occur and is occurring is the need to talk about what happened. And that continues. We can't, it's too quick to say that's enough, we're not going to talk about it anymore. It's too quick. We need to talk about it. I think Isadora, Isla Isadora, I think that's how you say her name. She wrote a book called Night Spirits. In it, she says we need to continue to tell our stories. Her people suffered from relocation. They were moved from their traditional territory to Churchill, where a significant number of them perished because of the disruption that happened in their culture as a result of it. But she writes that we need to continue to tell our story. Eventually they leave Churchill and move back to their territory at Dooley Lake. But she says we need to continue to tell our story until everyone's healed. And she says her story, she said, my story is a gift. My story is a gift. And I think about that. Indigenous people telling their story, it's a gift. It's a gift. And when we tell our story of brokenness, that's a gift, and it's a means to reconciliation. Indigenous people, again, as I said, have profoundly impacted me in how I'm able to understand and embrace, again, because of the attention to story, it had a profound effect on my ability to understand and embrace the gospel story. I thought that I was going to save my Indigenous people. I don't know if everyone starts off in that way in ministry, but I thought that I was going to save my Indigenous people. Because as my bio says, I was ordained in an evangelical church, Christian Missionary Alliance, and we believe that unless you attended a church of a certain ilk, you were not in. So if you hadn't prayed that prayer to receive Jesus, you weren't in. And now I know that it was not just church attendance and belonging to the right group that was important for North American Christians. And that was and is important to in North American Christianity. Indigenous people were thought to be an unreached people group, especially younger evangelical churches. They were thought to be an unreached people group. And so with evangelistic fervor, I thought that I was called by God to save my people. So then I went into ministry thinking, that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to save my people. Except when you begin to share the gospel, if you do it from the heart, something weird and wonderful happens in your own life, brought about by the gospel. And in my case, I found that my own Indigenous people saved me instead. It all came about because we were talking or trying to speak from the heart. Remember, I said that Indigenous people, they always talk to me in stories. I noticed that as I said, in my first ministries placement, whenever I would go visiting people who were from the church or visiting people who weren't in the church, but were just local, from the local Indigenous community, they were always willing to share from the heart. If they felt safe, they would begin to tell me all about what was going on in their life on the level of the heart. In Regina, Saskatchewan, that's when I began to understand the story in Regina, Saskatchewan. As I said, my first pastor was there. To be Indigenous in Regina, it meant that you were always facing some incredibly painful things, at least in those days. Regina at one time was called Waskana, pile of bones, because it was there that they piled up the bones of the buffalo to load on rail cars for processing somewhere, or so I'm told. Regina is the place where they hung Louis Riel. And there were several residential schools within a couple of hours driving distance. Suffice to say, there was pain all around. I'm probably being overly negative because people also shared their joy, because you could stand upon the land, as Neil MacLeod writes about Saskatchewan. You can stand upon the land as an Indigenous person and feel the land welcome you home. What I noticed, however, was they didn't spend a great deal of time, Indigenous people didn't spend a great deal of time trying to hide what was going on in their lives or in their heart. They spoke from the heart. This is why I say that I want to try and present the gospel in the heart language of the people, again, from my bio. I wanted Indigenous people begin with the heart, not primarily with the intellect, although intellect's important, but conversations typically begin at the level of the heart, at the level of emotions. They began with the heart by sharing their story, and as people told their story, I think I began to understand that when you speak from the heart, it brings together all of who you are, the real you. TT now wrote an essay and he said, orality has the potential to bring together intuition and reason, and I think emotion, in an attempt to make a connection with someone else. The story was fundamental to what was going on. And I listened to people. And I remember I listened to people and I thought about the gospel. To try to put the gospel in the heart language of people. I read Leslie Newbigin's idea about putting the gospel into the heart language of the people. And in order to learn the language of the people, he said there's a few sources. Political and social aspirations of people. The gospel and reconciliation must take into account the political and social aspirations of the people. The gospel's been able to empower many different groups to make large shifts in society. Liberation theology is one example. And so then for Indigenous people, the gospel has to take into account self-determination. And it must be able to see somehow that it's furthering the agenda or account for that in some way. The gospel has to be taken into account. That's the language of the people, the political, social aspirations, and of course the art forms, the music, the drum, and the art. And number three, the traditional spirituality of the people. For those are the categories that people think in, this spirituality of the people. And then I added one because it seemed to me, because of the way that I had experienced Indigenous people's story in ministry, is that you had to understand that it's on the level of human suffering, because the language of the people included their own suffering. And more importantly, it was a level of suffering where we were all equal. And so then, as I listened to people, residential schools, relocation, and the experience of the newcomers had become part of the communal memory of the people. And you had to listen to that story. You needed to. I don't mean you had to, like it was punishment. It was just how the story was told. To try to tell the story without that didn't tell the whole story. And this level of human suffering, that was the place of reconciliation. Reconciliation did not occur at the height of political power. You know, politicians make some statements and they're moving, like the apology in the House of Commons was moving, and then the fact that the Indigenous people's response was moving, and that is because it's speaking on the level of human suffering, I think. But it's not at the height of political power that things happen. It's not at the height of legal jurisprudence either. In fact, I think if left to lawyers, I'm not sure if you ever achieve reconciliation. And then it's not at the pinnacle of religious glory where we meet heart to heart. It's not. It's on the level of human suffering. That's where Christ meets us. That's where Christ meets us. Indigenous people were telling their story, and unless you were able to listen and feel the pain, how could you meet people heart to heart at a heart level? That's the level of reconciliation, unless you can listen and feel what people feel. I don't know how you would achieve reconciliation. And if you can't do that, I don't know how reconciliation could be healing. And what happened to me, I was going to share the gospel and I hope people would be converted, but it was only when I admitted the pain in my own heart, listened to the stories of Indigenous people who embraced Jesus, but were still in the middle of this shitstorm that was going on in their life. It was there that I realized I was being converted, because I experienced reconciliation with myself, and perhaps then was able to be used by the Creator. But who knows? So then reconciliation is healing. I say reconciliation is healing and not reconciliation and healing, because I didn't want to use a coordinating conjunction between those two, because then they could be conceived as two separate things. But the journey of reconciliation was a healing journey. In the journey of reconciliation, there needed to be a shift in how I thought about sin, healing, and reconciliation. There needed to be a reinterpretation to remember what these theological terms were all about. Indigenous understanding helped me in this process to hold up for you, because I thought it would, I thought it might help in the ongoing journey to understand what I went through in this journey of reconciliation. One of the things that happened is we developed this program called Inenimowin. In the book Reconciling Canada, one of the essays points out the problem with having a view of colonization that believes you can just remove the colonizers and then everything will be okay. This is what I mean by not owning their failures, or at least I think it could be a little more nuanced than it usually is. Because what we see right now is we realize colonization was a bad thing, but we don't own that failures as our failures because we want to blame it on somebody else. So I'm always worried that if you tear down statues, rename things, that you haven't really dealt with the heart. You haven't really dealt with the heart, which is where those things flow out of. Maybe that's not true. Maybe it is all flowing out of the heart, but I just wonder. In this essay, in a book called Reconciling Canada, the author of this essay, and I'm sorry I didn't look it up, it's either Patricia Montour or McKay. It's a McKay that wrote an article in there too, or Sophie McCall, one of those three. They point out that if if you think that just removing the colonizers is going to fix everything, then you don't understand the way that trauma works. Because what happened was we were abused, and then the lateral violence happened, and it spread throughout our culture, so that we continued to be impacted. I think we understand this reality that if someone experiences violence as a child, they will tend to use violence as an adult. I remember listening to an interview by the author of a book called Heartberries. And she said part of her healing journey was to learn to use something other than violence to try to defend herself. Because when you experience that as a kid, you use violence to try to defend yourself. And if someone experiences abuse as a child, they end up having a distorted view of themselves and others and of the creator. And oftentimes they feel ashamed of their own identity. This is what happens to Indigenous people and people of color. Often they believe the lies that society says about them, and they actually turn the shame they feel on themselves. It becomes illegitimate shame because they feel ashamed of who they are and their identity. And then they act out that shame. That shame turns into contempt, either self-contempt or other contempt. And it keeps showing up in our lives because it's part of the communal memory. These memories haunt us and they shape us. And some of us were looking for some way to help people work through these issues. We needed to help to reconcile with ourselves because we had begun to hate who we were as Indigenous people, to embrace the Indigenized identity that we had, not to keep trying to hide who we are, trying to be someone else. And one of the things we discovered or experienced was through training, a small group training. It's actually, again, mentioned in my bio today, this small group training. Originally, when we took it, it was called Survivors of Abuse Leadership Training. But we indigenized the whole program and called it Inenimowin. Inenimowin was an OG Cree word that was talking about your feelings. I remember when we came up with that name. I shouldn't say we, because it was Linda Martin who came up with that name. Linda's from Muskrat Dam, OG Cree speaker, and a trained counselor. And I remember we asked Linda, we were having this meeting when we were trying to indigenize this training that we'd taken. And we were there at Camp Arnez on the bank of Lake Winnipeg. And we asked Linda, what's a good Indigenous title for this training? Instead of Survivors of Abuse Leadership Training, what should we call it? And she said, we should call it Inenimowin. But I remember she had a longer sentence. She said, let's come away for a while and talk about the feelings we have in our heart. And so we called it Inenimowin. Let's come away for a while and talk about the feelings that we have in our heart. This was part of the process of embracing the story of residential school and relocation as part of our collective memory. We had to understand our story if we're going to find healing through the midst of the story. We had to remember it in different ways. The solution wasn't to forget, but the solution was to remember it in a different way. The process, so in Inenimowin, the whole process of the program, we would go apart for about 4 days. And in those days, we would begin to think about how the experience of trauma had impacted our lives. And we would do it by listening to one another's stories. The rhythm of each day was in 3. We would do this rhythm 3 times every day. We would have a plenary session where a leader would share part of their story and a teaching about working through trauma and then we would break into a group, a small group, and talk about how it impacted us. And each participant would begin to look at their own story. And as we looked at our story, we were helped by the group to see the distortions or lies that we had believed about ourselves. Our hope was that we could see ourselves differently. We could see that there was other ways of remembering what had happened to us instead of just self-hatred and contempt and trying to do enough good things so that we felt good about ourselves. we used two overarching concepts to encapsulate the program, or I did anyways. I always have to have this picture in my mind of what we're doing. One of the pictures in my mind was we used the Eucharist. I borrowed this idea from Inenimowin in Life of the Beloved, just as Christ was taken, blessed, broken, and given, so we're taken, blessed, broken, and given. The other overarching concept I used in my mind was the vision quest. So the vision quest of the Northern Plains people typically involved, you started with a sweat lodge ceremony or some kind of ceremony, and then you go into the wilderness to an appointed place, and you're alone for 4 days, and you fast and pray, seeking a vision of your authentic self. On the third day, the demons come and you resist them or fight them off. And on the fourth day, you get a vision. And once you have a vision, you come back to the village, and an elder helps you to understand how that vision is lived out, how you live out that vision. Inenimowin was like a vision quest, in that we would come away for 4 days, and we were fasting from all the things we'd used to avoid talking about what was really going on inside. We were not alone, but we were each of us learning to embrace our own story and the trauma that we had experienced. We were seeking a vision by trying to understand what our life would look like if we loved with our whole heart. What if we really did not have to protect ourselves, but were free to love? What would that look like? And this small group was learning to help one another to see that God not only loved us, but he liked us. He liked us. And like the vision quest, usually on the third day, all hell breaks loose at these things. Like usually, if you ever teach an intensive, somewhere day 3 or day 4, the whole group starts to mutiny. They sort of say things, oh, this is stupid. I don't know why we're doing this. But we talked about it and we got through that. And usually by the 4th day, people would begin to feel or see a change. And they would start to see that they still were, that God could use them. It was like a vision quest. The whole process was helping us embrace the love of the Creator, because many of us believed that we were too bad to be loved by God. And we struggled hard not to believe that, but many of us did. We were taken, blessed. It was also like the Eucharist. We were taken and blessed. So just as Christ was taken and blessed, just like the bread and the cup and the Eucharist is taken and blessed, we would talk about that, and I would talk about that. Yet, if we're taken and blessed, why are so many of us struggling in our lives with the impact of generational trauma? Nouwen writes that the first step of Christian discipleship is to understand that you are the beloved. Indigenous understanding believed that a child is self-actualized. They are sacred. But when they're wounded by others, they begin to stop trusting. And as they grow and are wounded more and more, they stop feeling because it hurts too much. They believe lies about themselves and begin to act out illegitimate shame upon themselves and others. They shift to not living, but only surviving and coping. You have to learn how this is true for yourself as well if you're going to meet Indigenous people and speak heart to heart. You have to understand how that describes you too. Many of us, not just Indigenous people, I don't know if many of us who claim to be Christian have come to the place where you understand that Jesus not only loves us, but he likes us. He likes us. A leader in Inenimowin must learn their own sad story. People are trapped by the sin of others. This is how the understanding of sin needed to shift, because they were trapped by others. When people are abused, they're trapped. They're trapped and they can't get out. So many people shut down feeling. They don't feel anymore because it hurts too much. But when you shut your feelings down, you can't feel love either. You can't feel love either. If sin is anything that blocks us from experiencing the love of God, then many people who suffered abuse are trapped by sin, and it's not their fault. It's not their fault, but they're trapped by it and they need help to get out. They need help to get out. They needed a way out. This was a reinterpretation of sin that didn't throw innocent victims under the bus. Sin was not so much a set of activities that people chose to do. It was something much worse. Sin was something that could block the love of God and make innocent victims believe that they were unlovable. And that's what happened. So Christ was taken and blessed, but why are we in such a mess? And then we talk about Christ was broken. And we are broken. So the second step of Christian discipleship is to be broken. And what Inenimowin could do was to help people see that just as Christ was broken, he was innocent and he suffered, so we have been broken. We tried to build a safe place for people to feel their brokenness, really just begin to feel, and perhaps provide a place where people could remember their brokenness in a different way, come to the place that we understood that what others meant for bad, God or the Creator could still somehow bring good in us and through us. So we needed to build a safe place. Learning to help people feel and embrace brokenness meant that we had to relearn how to be with people who were hurting. This meant we had to learn not to just come up and be glad handing and hugging people, because people who had been abused might not like strangers coming up and touching them because they'd been touched in so many ways. So you had to learn to ask permission. Remember, a protocol is important. You have to ask permission to hug. You had to learn to let people be angry and cry and yell and feel, because the feelings were not the problem. The feelings were trying to point out the distortions. They were trying to help heal. As people expressed what they felt and embraced the brokenness, they encountered Christ or the Creator in the group, who kept telling them that Jesus or the Creator not only loved them, but he liked them. Jesus was in the midst of the pain. He was not the pain, but he was there in the midst of the pain. And as we embraced our pain, we discovered lies about ourselves that we believed, that we'd heard from others. And we believed those lies, and we discovered them, and we were able to let them go. In my own life, I remember talking about to a friend of mine. I remember experiencing it. I could see it in my head when bad stuff had happened. And I was really hurt. I remember making this vow: no one will ever hurt me like that again. I'll always know what to do. I'll always know what to do. So in ministry, whenever someone talked to me about, that's why I still struggle when people critique me, because it brings back those feelings of when I was a kid and they were telling me I didn't know what to do. And I just feel like I always got to know what to do. And I remember I'm there and I felt all that pain. And I said to Larry, I said, I just feel like someone who's been abused. I just feel this pain. And he said, there's something worse than your pain. And I said, what? He said, it's your sin. And I said, you jerk. Like, who says that to someone who's feeling pain? And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, you believe you're unlovable. You believe you're unlovable. And that struck me. I thought that Jesus couldn't love me. I was too bad. And then it occurred to me that a lot of people that I worked with in my church, a lot of us Indigenous people my age, we all thought like that. We were unlovable. We were too bad. And we deserved to suffer. We embraced the brokenness, and then we found Christ, and the group was the voice of Christ who said, no, I not only love you, but I like you. And then just because Christ was given, we were given. We wanted to affirm to people that life was coming out of them, even if they were broken. This was empowering to us half-healed people, because we realized that we had something to offer. We had our story, our own sad story. When remembered in different ways, when remembered and held beside our story with Christ, it brought healing. This meant we did not have to be completely healed to minister or be used by the Creator as a positive force. Healing then meant to embrace our own story, our own identity, all that it was, and the way that it began, and begin to move toward healing. To see the complicated nature of life and learn to forgive ourselves and to forgive others. Of course, as soon as I say forgive ourselves, I kind of I think, oh no, I just sound like one of those crazy 1970s psychiatrists. It sounds like a cliche. Maybe it'd be better to come to understand that Jesus not only loves me, but he likes me. He likes us, that we're taken blessed. We're taken and blessed, that you are the beloved, to embrace our brokenness, that you're broken just as Jesus was broken. And even in our brokenness, as we embrace our broken life, all that it is, with all the failures and all the shortcomings, and we embrace it and try to use the feelings and the energy to try to move towards healing and harmony as that we see around us in creation. But that's what reconciliation, to begin to speak from the heart, and then reconciliation would be healing. It's reconciliation is healing, to speak from the heart. The three things the church can be involved in right now, I've been saying: heal the land, raise emotional intelligence, cast a broader vision for unity. And this learning to speak from the heart, that would help us raise emotional intelligence. You can't lead someone someplace where you've never gone. If you want to be part of healing, or should I say, if you want to be aware of your role in the journey of healing, then you need to learn your story. You need to touch the pain in your heart and be able to understand who you are, knowing your story, so that you can meet others who are stuck there. And as they see you move slowly through your story and be with them, perhaps they can find strength with you to begin to feel, to live, and to heal. It's been healing to me to be able to embrace my own identity, to own my failures. But those who have heard my story did not leave me there. They helped me to see the distortions and to embrace the love of the Creator. This made me free, or freer, I should say, because I realized that all I had to do was receive the love of God and love others. To me, that's freedom. Thank you for listening to me. And I hope that was helpful, and perhaps you have some questions.
Thanks so much, Ray. There's a comment maybe that you could respond to in the chat box. It says, I want to say colonizers must feel shame, as they are liars. I've not kept the promises. They have lied. They are not only sinners in Christian faith, but also criminals in the secular law. To be honest, I wonder why Indigenous people feel shame. The Indigenous people deserve dignity.
Well, that's probably all true.
Mm-hmm.
But the experience, at least of my generation, was, and probably the way that it works is that that's the sad thing, is that people don't, like, people, when you suffer abuse and trauma, you end up feeling shame for stuff that it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And so that's what we were trying to help people understand. And you're right that legitimate shame, which is what you're describing in that comment, is supposed to help people do the right thing. And the reason that Indigenous people should, that's the nature of sin. I thought that's the nature of sin, is that you end up feeling shame for stuff that's not your fault. And so yeah, it's all muddled up. So now some people respond by not wanting to use the word shame anymore, and I suppose that's legitimate. But I try to differentiate between legitimate shame and illegitimate shame. So I don't know, I hope that helps.
Thanks. Friends, you're welcome. Hubert's typed into the chat box. Please, if you have a question, you can type them in here, and either Hubert or I will address them to Ray. So your interaction is most welcome.
Any questions?
Well, there's, go ahead, Hubert. I think there's one there.
There's a comment here from Rita. I'm struck by the courage of the Indigenous people in speaking from the heart. I wonder how newcomers can be courageous in the listening.
Well, what we teach, what we try to, the part of the small group training was helping people to teach people how to listen and to not fix, and part of it was to just help people empathetic listening. So then that's the part where I talked about you learn, don't hug people and don't touch people. Just when they're talking about their story and they begin to experience emotion, you don't put your hand on their shoulder, because they'll stop feeling, they'll stop talking about what's going on. You don't hand them a Kleenex, because then they'll stop crying. And if they need to feel, right now, there's points where if it gets out of control, there's some stuff you can do. You can help people ground themselves, and, but I'm talking about just as they begin to feel and work through those feelings, because the feelings, I think the feelings are to help us heal. So, and then the group also reflects back what they hear, because in a situation like that, when it's safe to talk about our stories, sometimes our illegitimate shame comes out, because we'll start to say things about ourselves. I'm so stupid. Why did I do that? I'm so, and then the group can tell them. Sometimes you're like a priest in that you just tell them they're forgiven, they're forgiven. And other times you listen and you remind them, like when you hear them telling lies about themselves, you say, that's not true, right? That's not true. So that's kind of how you listen and you respond. We also always work in groups, teams of two. You always lead a group in a team of two, because sometimes you get caught up and traumatized yourself, and you got to take a minute to sort of collect yourself. So that's kind of what we tried to. And if you can learn those things, then you learn how to listen to people. My wife is a great example. People just open up to her. She just listens, and they just talk. They tell her all about themselves. I got to think that's helpful. So.
Ray, a comment here. I'm interested in the distinction you make between being loved by Jesus and being liked by Jesus. Could you say a bit more about that?
I think there's other people who said, I think, I forget who. Well, Jesus has to love us, right? So then there's that idea that what I'm meaning was that now I don't know if it still holds true, but the statement, God loves you or Jesus loves you, has little rhetorical value in most churches, because you hear that all the time. So then it's just a mundane statement. It has no rhetorical value. It doesn't produce any, most of the time doesn't produce any feelings. But if you tell people that Jesus likes them, I can always see it in their face. They go, there's something happens, so it has rhetorical value. And if you, in my own life, it meant that when I came to understand that Jesus not only loved me, but he liked me, that was that statement that you are the beloved, that you understand that you are the beloved. Then all my efforts to earn God's love, I could let those go. Because I think at that time in my life, that most stuff I did always had that sort of, because I was doing it because I hoped if I did enough stuff, God would like me. God would think I was the okay guy. Even though I embraced the gospel of grace and I knew that Jesus loved me and he died for me, but I just wasn't sure that he liked me. And that I always walked around feeling shame. And I think I was set free from that, realized how big a lie that was. So that's kind of why I made that distinction. So, but in your situation, wherever you are, maybe Jesus likes you, just has no rhetorical value. So maybe you'd have to come up with another way to say it. So.
I have a comment and a question. This one is Ray, I think we are just taking in the depth and profundity of what you are telling us. The emotional intelligence learning goal is really worthy. Thank you so much for this sharing. And this is from Carrie. Thank you, Ray, for your openness. Can you say more about the last piece of reconciliation? First was heal the land. Second was emotional intelligence. And I heard that last one was a broader vision of, you missed the last part.
A broader vision of unity. For this one, I thought we need to meet at a heart level. Like I thought again, I borrowed from Henry Nouwen in a talk one time, because I was speaking at York University and a bunch of law students were there. And I remember I talked about restorative justice. And I don't know if it was a good move, but I just thought I borrowed a line from a book by Henry Nouwen. It's called Life Signs. And in it, he said that one of the signs of life in Christ is the presence of intimacy and solidarity. Those are the flip sides. So you experience intimacy, and then with people who you maybe aren't in your community, you still feel a sense of solidarity. So those two things, intimacy and solidarity. And the enemy of those is fear. Like fear, if you live in a house of fear, then intimacy and solidarity are diminished, if not absent at times. And it seems to me, because our justice system was so focused on punishing people, the idea being that if we just punished everybody who did wrong, then we would have a just society. But I don't think that that's necessarily true, because if you punish everybody, then you could end up just producing a fearful society. It seems to me that people who are always focused on punishing are just fearful. And they think if they just punish enough people or have more security, bigger guns, bigger walls, stronger laws, stronger courts, then somehow that will guarantee a just society. But what if a just society is a society that's growing, that its members have a growing sense of intimacy and solidarity? I said, it seems to me that if we focus on right relatedness, that this could produce a society that was growing in intimacy and solidarity, which would be experienced as a freer society and a more equitable society. So I think that's one of the tasks that the church needs to do and needs to model in its ecumenism and its interreligious dialogue, that there's something about that we could model for all of society in coming together in intimacy and solidarity. So anyways, I think we need to cast that as a vision. And I hope to talk about that more next week as we think about reconciliation as a journey, right? Journey and destination.
Thanks, Ray. The question here, what happened to your healing group? Inenimowin, what's it you call it?
Inenimowin. Well, we shifted the name a little bit. We ended up doing some of those things we called ministry in the midst of trauma through the teaching house that moves around. And we still try to do kinds of things like that, So I just use that as an example, but there's lots of groups that are like that. And I think that they're important things to do. I didn't want to say that that's the only one you could do, because anytime you could bring people together where they told the truth, they really listened, and then they came up with a shared plan. So on one level, like blanket exercise does things like that. There was the Rising Above conferences. different conferences. That was one where we took some training and we tried to indigenize. And again, we need a variety of things because not everybody sees things the same way. And we still try to do, I'm going to try to do an Inenimowin-like thing, hopefully maybe in September. I'd like to try to do it in Vancouver if we could find a place to do it. We were going to try to do something at the cathedral, and then another wave of COVID hit, and we still haven't picked that up. So it's still something we're doing ongoing. Thanks for asking.
Thank you. That answers Meg's question. She was wondering what the name of the training was. It was in Inenimowin. And this one is from Heather. Would you say more, please, about speaking from the heart? Learning to speak from the heart, especially for people who are well practiced at living in their heads and responding from intellect only.
I'm an expert at speaking from my head because I used it for years to avoid how you not speak. Maybe one of the ways is you realize how not to speak from the heart. So this is how I don't speak from the heart, is I intellectualize. And so how it showed up often in my relationship with my wife is that we'd be in an argument and I'd start to wax eloquent about why she was feeling the way she was, using all the finest psychological terms to describe why this was occurring, why we were having this disagreement. Well, this is because you're projecting onto me these certain unfulfilled expectations that you have because of the relationship that you had with your father or your mother. So that's it, speaking from the head. Also, you do it from the pulpit when you just try to talk about theology and use a lot of big words. I'm not against using big words. I shouldn't say that, because some people are very good at blending those things together. But there was a part where you were not talking about what was going on inside. So then I began to try to always use illustrations that happened in my life, not from someplace else. And I tried also not to stop being the hero in my own stories, although I might have just violated by telling you how I speak from the heart. So anyways, the idea was that you were making yourself vulnerable. But it's dangerous because it's dangerous because people will use it against you. People will use it against you. So it's not if they will, they just do. I mean, we're human beings, and that's the tough part about ministry, is that, and anybody's a minister knows that. How does the joke go? What's for lunch besides the pastor and his sermon? So anyways, that's what's speaking from the heart. I can feel it when I'm doing it. I don't know if that helps, if you're kind of a person is well connected. At this point in my life, I think I can feel it when I'm speaking from the heart. It feels like my body relaxes and it's not taking as much energy. And I notice that my voice tends to smoothen out. I feel different when I speak from the heart, if that helps. I don't know.
Ray, there's a few comments here, but not questions, but someone says they'll think of questions later. But a thank you to you for sharing your story and Canada's Indigenous story, plus a reminder that God likes us as well as loving us. Someone else says, thank you for your thoughts about intimacy and solidarity with others versus fear of others, and the bent to punish rather than restore. And I look forward to next week's lecture.
All right. Hey, well, Richard, do you have any questions?
No, I mean, my questions came up in other people's questions, which is really quite delightful. I liked the piece you talked about, the difference between God loving us and liking us. Do you think that's also true of that's important for us to say to each other, Ray? Like I sometimes hear in church to say, I love you, I just don't like you. Do you know what I mean? People say that to each other. Do you think that if we get that right, maybe between us and Jesus, does that help us get it right between each other a little bit better?
Oh, I sure hope so. I sure hope so that we could maybe like each other too. That would be even better.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what Bonhoeffer thought. Bonhoeffer thought, right? Bonhoeffer thought that Christ was not only the mediator between the Creator and us, but also the mediator between us. That's what was that's what was needed. So.
Ray, there's a question here. It strikes me that to do reconciliation work, settlers need to be aware of their own humanity and brokenness. Is there any story you can tell us about that, or about this?
Well, I was hoping that when I shifted about telling the story, that was the opportunity. I thought that the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the voice of Indigenous people speaking about, that their protests at Ipperwash and other places. And I actually thought that COVID would be an opportunity for not just Canada, but the world to embrace its own, to embrace that we're human beings and we're limited and we're completely dependent upon the Creator. Like we're broken, and without the grace of the Creator, then we could not survive. And it's manifested to us through the earth, and that we would somehow take a moment to just pause and reflect on that. When Indigenous people pray in the 4 directions, or most of the ceremonies, like in Hawaii, I was at a service where they blew this shell and they blow it to all the directions to call the ancestors. When you do that, that's supposed to produce humility, because you realize how short your life is, because there's thousands of years of ancestors before us, and there'll probably be thousands of years after us. And it's supposed to make us understand that we're human beings and we're dependent upon one another in the earth. Like all of the structures and all of the ceremonies are to remind us. When you dance powwow, Hubert could talk about his culture. When you dance powwow, you always dance those dances for others. Yes, it's fulfilling for you, but you're always doing them for others. It's not just for you. And my understanding of even following Christ, that it's always for others. It's not just for you. But that's the nature of love, right? Didn't Plato or someone say that there's a selfishness to it too, that you love and you try to give it away, but it always keeps coming back to you. So that's what I was thinking about. I was hoping that the story is there, and that people in Canada would listen to it.
You have a question here from Natika. How to become better at being trauma informed as church leaders, especially during sermons and having one-on-one conversations? Also, how do we talk about sin with someone who has been traumatized without re-traumatizing?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So the things that we did was, so one of them was to just tell your own story. And then we talked about how shame worked. That explanation of how shame worked, and just saying that oftentimes when you're not talking about them, but you're talking about oftentimes when people suffer abuse. So that's the part of the training from the field of recovery and from the survivors of abuse. You just talk about how shame works, that we people who suffered abuse actually feel ashamed, a shame that is rightfully their perpetrators. When we were dealing with Christian people, we would just talk. There's several stories in Scripture that talk about sexual abuse, and it paints a picture of what's going on. the story of Tamar is an example of, she's abused by her brother, and then eventually it leads to Absalom killing her brother, and it just points to all the difficulty of relationship. We tried to talk to people about shame, and we just showed there was always someone who had a story about how the shame, if it's illegitimate, we talk about the difference between legitimate and illegitimate shame. Legitimate shame, when you really do something wrong, wants to lead you back into relationship. It's sort of just pointing the way, giving you energy to do that. But illegitimate shame just wants to destroy you, and it doesn't point to any redemptive kind of thing, but it just produces contempt, which usually becomes self-contempt or other contempt. The other thing we did is we didn't make it, we tell people they don't have to talk, they don't have to tell us all the gory details about what happened. What we focus on is the distortions that happened because of what happened. And so in that way, we weren't trying to bring up everything that happened. This isn't a thing about recovering lost memories. This is about how this is impacting us and the distortions that we've embraced or lies we've believed about ourselves because of what happened. So we're actually trying to shift away from focusing on the person who did this to us, because then I don't know how that helps, but we're trying to focus on shifting away. I used to say statements like, we're not asking you to open the whole can of worms, just take one, just open the can, take one worm out, and we'll just deal with that. We have lots of time. We don't have to deal with everything here, which is the other thing we did. We just said, we can be slow about this. This doesn't have to be fast. Slow is fast. So then and being patient and never forcing anybody. And we're just being okay with that. So that's kind of some of the things we did. And also always having, like when we do these, we always, at the beginning, we have the duty to report. We talk about how I'm a minister, and we also always have 2 trained counselors with us. And we tell people, look, we're required that if you reveal that you are abusing someone, then we are required by law to report that to the appropriate authorities. We tell that people up front. And we also tell people that if you display suicidal ideation or something, we're required to report that to the appropriate authorities. So we kind of tell people everything up front. We try to just be honest about what's going on and not try to surprise anybody with anything. We also don't do any ceremony at the beginning, because sometimes people experienced abuse in the midst of ceremony, Christian ceremonies and other ceremonies. So we don't do any. We just try to speak heart to heart, gently, and those are some of the things we do. And also halfway through the training, we would begin to close up the wounds, because we don't want to leave people just wounded. Like, you don't want to do that. You just don't want to raise a bunch of stuff and then leave people wounded. Because most of our stories have a measure of healing. So then you tell your story slowly. So you slowly, and then so towards the end, you sort of begin to tell what healing looked like. So then people can also sort of realize that they're on a journey. And so that's what we tried to do. So hope that helps.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ray, for this evening. Once again, we've been really helped, edified, built up, listening to your wisdom. A number of people have noticed how you're able to tell us the truth, but gently, so that we can hear it. So thank you very much for that gift that is very much yours. A reminder to everyone that May 11th is the final lecture in this 4-lecture series, Indigenizing Canada. And as Ray's mentioned, reconciliation as a journey and as a destination. All of these lectures are recorded and they've been uploaded to VST's YouTube channel. So if you want to view them again, or if you think there are others who would benefit from seeing them, they're there as a resource for you and for the communities of which you're a part. So on behalf, let me say thank you to Ray, thank you to Joseph, who manages the technology every week, and thanks so much for Hubert for co-hosting our series with us. And I wish you a great evening. Thank you. And thanks, Ray.
Thanks, everybody. See you later.